Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We take deep dives into captivating stories that leave you wanting more. And today we are traveling to Flint, Michigan, a city whose name has become synonymous with a public health crisis.
Yeah.
That really shook the nation. Imagine turning on your tap, and instead of that, crystal clear water, you're met with a murky, discolored liquid. It just smells like something's off. That's the reality the residents of Flint faced back in 2014. And the consequences of this seemingly simple water switch are still being felt today.
You know, what's so fascinating to me here is that a decision that was made to save money, like that seems logical, right? But it ended up having just these disastrous consequences. It affected the lives of over 100,000 people. And the most heartbreaking part, it could have been prevented.
So let's rewind to 2014. Flint, like a lot of cities in the Rust Belt, was facing financial difficulties. To cut costs, the city decided to switch its water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River. It seemed like a temporary fix while a new pipeline was being built, but as we know, things went terribly wrong. What happened once they flipped that switch?
Well, almost immediately, residents started noticing problems. The water tasted strange, it had a really unpleasant odor, and it often looked discolored, like brown and rusty. Now, anyone who's ever, seen rusty water knows it's not something you want to be drinking. It's a pretty clear sign that the water is corrosive. The problem was the Flint River water wasn't properly treated to combat this corrosiveness, before being pumped into people's homes.
So how did this corrosive water end up contaminating the entire system with lead?
Okay, so imagine the water pipes in your home as like the veins and arteries of a city's water system. In Flint, many of these veins were made of lead. It was a material commonly used in older pumping systems. When that corrosive water flowed through these aging lead pipes, it caused the lead to, leach into the water supply.
Oh, wow.
Think of it like rust eating away at metal. But in this case, it was the corrosive water eating away at the lead pipes. And it was contaminating the water people were using for drinking, cooking, and bathing.
That's terrifying. And we all know lead is toxic, especially for children. What were the immediate impacts of this lead contamination on the people of Flint?
Well, the effects of lead poisoning, especially on children, can be devastating. Lead is a neurotoxin, meaning it affects the brain and the nervous system. For kids, even low levels of lead exposure can lead to developmental delays, learning difficulties, and behavioral problems. What's so insidious about lead poisoning is that the symptoms can be very subtle. They might not show up right away, which can lead to long-term health consequences, which could have been avoided.
And to make matters worse, it wasn't as if these warning signs were going unnoticed.
Right.
Residents were complaining, but their concerns were initially dismissed.
Absolutely. There were widespread complaints about the water's taste, smell, and appearance, but these initial red flags were ignored. Officials repeatedly assured the public that the water was safe, even going so far as to have the mayor drink Flint tap water on television. This, of course, did little to alleviate the fears of residents, who were experiencing the reality of the situation firsthand.
It's hard to imagine the frustration and fear those residents must have felt having their concerns brushed aside by the very people who were supposed to be protecting them. What finally forced officials to acknowledge the crisis? Was there a tipping point?
It took the courage and persistence of a few individuals to really break through that wall of denial.
This is where the story gets even more intriguing. If you're finding this as captivating as we are, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of our deep dive. We'll be back in just a moment to uncover the truth about how the Flint water crisis was finally exposed and the repercussions that followed.
Welcome back to Tell Me More. So before the break, we were talking about how the people of Flint were experiencing these horrific effects of the lead-contaminated water. And all the while, officials are denying there's any issue at all. But, the truth always has a way of coming to light. And in Flint, it came from some really unlikely sources, a concerned mother and a vigilant EPA manager.
You're talking about Leanne Walters and Miguel Del Torrell, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about their roles in exposing the truth about what was going on with the water in Flint?
Absolutely. So Leanne Walters was a resident in Flint, and her children were experiencing these health issues, and she suspected they were linked to the water. She was just relentless in her pursuit of answers. She was conducting her own tests at home. She was contacting experts outside of the city government, and her persistence led her to Mark Edwards. He was a renowned water expert at Virginia Tech.
So she reached out to a university professor all on her own. That's incredible initiative.
It really is. And Edwards was really the perfect person to contact. You see, he had a reputation for taking on these really challenging cases. And he had actually previously investigated water contamination issues in Washington, D.C. So Edwards and his team traveled to Flint. They conducted their own independent testing, and they confirmed Leanne's worst fears. The water in her home had dangerously high levels of lead.
I'm sensing a theme here. It seems like it was the people who were most affected by this crisis who were the ones taking action and demanding answers.
You're absolutely right. Around the same time that Leanne was fighting for her children's health, we have Miguel del Toral. He was an EPA manager, and he was also raising concerns about lead contamination in Flint's water. And he faced a lot of internal resistance and pushback from his superiors, but he just refused to let the issue be swept under the rug. He continued to investigate, and eventually his findings were leaked to the press. This shined a national spotlight on the crisis that was brewing in Flint.
So you have a concerned mother and an EPA employee both uncovering this truth. Yet you have these local officials who are still downplaying the severity of the problem. What finally forced them to admit that there was something seriously wrong with Flint's water?
It was the combination of that mounting evidence that we were talking about from all these independent sources, coupled with a groundbreaking study by Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. She was a pediatrician in Flint, and she noticed this alarming increase in lead levels in the blood of children after that water switch. Her research was published in the American Journal of Public Health, and it provided undeniable proof that the water was indeed poisoning the city's children. It was a moment of reckoning, and the story quickly gained national attention. It sparked outrage and calls for accountability.
It's tragic that it took the suffering of innocent children to force those in power to finally take action. So what happened next? Did things start to improve once the crisis was officially acknowledged?
Well, the city eventually switched back to the Detroit water system. This happened in October of 2015, but the damage was already done. Thousands of children had been exposed to high levels of lead, and those long-term health consequences were a major concern.
This wasn't just a case of a few bad decisions. This was a complete systemic failure, right?
Absolutely. The Flint water crisis exposed this web of bureaucratic incompetence, political maneuvering, and this disturbing disregard for the well-being of a largely Black and low-income community. It brought to light the stark realities of environmental racism.
We'll definitely delve into the concept of environmental racism and its role in this after the break. This story is far from over. When we return, we'll discuss the fallout from the crisis, the legal battles, and the long-term impact on the people of Flint. Welcome back to Tell Me More. We've been uncovering the story of the Flint water crisis, a story that goes beyond just contaminated water. It's about a breakdown in trust, a failure of government at multiple levels, and really just the devastating consequences of environmental racism.
Yeah, it's a story that raises some fundamental questions about, who gets protected and whose voices are heard, or more importantly, ignored when it comes to environmental justice.
You mentioned environmental racism before. Can you explain how that concept played a role in the Flint water crisis?
Sure. So environmental racism refers to the disproportionate burden of environmental hazards and pollution that are placed on communities of color and low-income communities. In the case of Flint, a city with a majority Black population and high poverty rates, the decision to use a cheaper, less treated water source was made with little regard for the potential health risks to residents. It's a pattern we see repeated across the country, where communities that lack political and economic power are often the ones forced to bear the brunt of environmental damage.
It's a sobering reminder that environmental justice is inextricably linked to social and racial justice. Once the crisis came to light, what were the consequences for those responsible? Was there any accountability?
Yeah, the response was multifaceted. There were multiple investigations launched at the state and federal levels. This led to criminal charges against several government officials, including the former governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder. Several emergency managers appointed by the state to oversee Flint's finances were also charged. It was a really landmark case, showing that those in power could be held legally responsible for their actions, or in this case, inaction.
That's a bit of a silver lining, I suppose, knowing that there were some legal repercussions. But what about the long-term impact on the people of Flint? How are they coping with the aftermath of this crisis?
The physical and emotional scars run deep. Even though the water quality has improved significantly since the switch back to the Detroit water system, many residents remain understandably distrustful of their tap water. They rely on bottled water for drinking and cooking. And the trauma of not knowing if the water coming out of their taps is safe continues to affect their daily lives.
I can only imagine the lasting impact that has on the community psyche. It's a betrayal of trust that's hard to overcome.
Absolutely. And beyond the immediate health concerns, there are long-term implications for children's development, education, and overall well-being. The full extent of the damage caused by lead exposure might not be known for years to come.
The Flint water crisis is a cautionary tale about the fragility of our infrastructure and the consequences of neglecting basic needs like clean water. It's also a stark reminder that we can't take safe drinking water for granted. It's a right, not a privilege.
And that's the key takeaway here. We need to be vigilant, not just in Flint, but in our own communities. We need to ask questions about where our water comes from, how it's treated, and who's responsible for ensuring its safety. The lessons of Flint are relevant everywhere. We all have a role to play in advocating for clean, safe drinking water for all.
Powerful words to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Flint water crisis. We hope you found it informative and, most importantly, that it inspires you to take action in your own community. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.